In 1999, a brother and sister, Curtis and Catherine Jones, became the youngest murder convicted in United States history at 12 and 13 years old. Initially portrayed in the press as cold and cruel killers, the truth emerges a few years later, upsetting public opinion and completely reviving this case. Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. I'm delighted to see you again for a new video. The case we are going to explore today is deeply shocking, with a reversal of the situation that has profoundly shaken the United States. I really can't wait to read your reactions, because personally, I have a hard time making a definitive opinion. But without further ado, I propose you to discover together all the details of this deadly truth. It was at the age of 17, while working at a KFC in Palo Alto, California, that Stacey Parks met the future father of her children. Curtis Jones, who was 23 years old, was one of her clients, and she immediately fell under his spell. Stacey's parents, who are white, don't look very kindly on their daughter dating a black man. Despite their objections, the couple began an affair, and very quickly, 6 months later, Stacey discovered that she was pregnant with a baby girl. Unfortunately, everything is not going well in the couple. Curtis is abusive, and long before she gets pregnant at the beginning of their relationship, he starts hitting her. Stacey feels trapped. I imagine that she has isolated herself from her family, and especially from her parents, who do not condone her relationship. One day, while she is pregnant, Curtis beats her more violently than usual, and the consequences are terrible for the baby she is carrying. Suffering from a torn uterus, she gave birth prematurely on June 6, 1985. She is a very little girl, Catherine, who comes into the world weighing only 1.4 kilos. She was nicknamed Munchie. At that time, her mother was 18 years old, and her father was 24. On May 31, 1986, less than a year later, she gave birth to a baby boy, whom the couple decided to name Curtis after his father. In the meantime, they have moved from California to Alabama. Despite the premature birth of her first baby girl and Stacey's second pregnancy, the couple's relationship remains very difficult. Curtis continues to beat the young mother. She tries several times to escape his grasp, but he always manages to convince her to stay. Despite this violent and toxic relationship, in 1989, 3 years after Curtis was born, the couple married. However, a few months later, Stacey, who is now 22 years old, flees the family home for good. At the end of her strength, isolated, she secretly sells one of her gold chains to buy a bus ticket and return to her parents' home in Kansas. Unfortunately, she runs away alone, leaving her 3- and 4-year-old children with their father, firstly because her parents don't want her to bring home little mixed-race children, and secondly because Curtis has always been clear he will never let her take her children away from him. Alone, isolated, frightened, she flees alone, heartbroken. After his wife left, Curtis took steps to obtain custody of his children. Stacey also wants her, but her personal and professional situation does not allow her to have custody. She doesn't work. She doesn't have a fixed address. I don't know if she mentioned the violence she was suffering or if she couldn't prove it, but she is forced to pay alimony and only has visitation rights during the summer holidays. Children therefore grow up with their father, but not in the best environment. A few months after their mother's departure, on October 2, 1989, their father was charged with attempted second-degree murder after shooting 2 men in a pool hall. In the end, the justice system ruled that it was a question of self-defense, and the accusations were transformed into a misdemeanor. While he is in trouble with the law, the children end up at the home of their grandmother, Curtis's mother. There they live with one of their uncles, a man who is not very friendly. He is a notorious delinquent. In the past, he served 6 years in prison for theft. On September 23, 1993, he was found guilty of having sexual relations with the daughter of one of his companions, who was only 14 years old. Despite these terrible accusations, everyone in the family thinks it is normal to let him live with Catherine and Curtis Jr., who are 7 and 8 years old at the time of his conviction. It is at this time that Stacy, unable to bring herself to live without her children, picks them up after school to bring them back to Kansas. Curtis files a complaint. She is found and arrested. The children are placed in foster care while waiting for their father to pick them up. It is a traumatic experience for them. In this ambient chaos, the brother and sister are very close. Catherine is very protective of her little brother, playing the role of a surrogate mother. At school, the children are considered very intelligent but very undisciplined. They are both sent to a special school. Curtis Jr. in particular is described as a rough and boisterous little boy. At the beginning of January 1999, Catherine and Curtis, who were 12 and 13 years old at the time, got their hands on their father's gun, its magazine and ammunition, while rummaging through his belongings. They hid everything for almost a week. On January 6, 1999, that day at home there was only Nicole, their father's new partner. They had been in a relationship for nearly 6 months. The children know that their father will not return until later in the evening. The 29-year-old is in the living room, at the table, doing a puzzle. At one point, Catherine and Curtis join her at the table, but what Nicole doesn't know is that the young teenager intends to commit the irreparable. He was holding the pistol in his lap when suddenly he pointed the gun at his mother-in-law and fired a first shot that hit her in the chest. He fired several times before dropping the weapon. Catherine then grabbed it and began to shoot as well. A total of 9 bullets were fired, and 4 hit their mother-in-law, who was lying on the ground. After this terrible act, Curtis is in shock. He begins to shake uncontrollably and cry. The children, totally distraught, pull Nicole's body into the bathroom, leaving behind a trail of blood. They then decided to erase this trail with bleach that they poured on the floor and on the carpet. Totally shocked by what they have just done, they then flee the house to go to the house of one of their friends who lives in the neighborhood. They tell her that they have just accidentally shot their mother-in-law and killed her. Their friend, upset, then tells his parents, who decide to contact the police to tell it all. But as soon as their backs are turned, the children flee. Once the alert was given, the police did not take long to arrive on the scene. The first evidence found on the spot does not suggest that it was an accident. The body was moved, the traces of blood were cleaned. They then set off in search of the 2 children considered fugitives. It is only the next morning that they find them both hidden in a vacant lot, having spent a freezing night, huddled together under a blanket hidden in bushes. The children were arrested and immediately interrogated. Very quickly, under pressure from the investigators, they admit that it was not an accident and that they intended to kill Nicole. After a 9 a.m. interrogation, the police are convinced that Catherine and Curtis Jr. were jealous of the attention their father gave to his partner. He didn't spend as much time with them as he used to. They felt him drifting away from them, and that's why they wanted to get rid of her. Catherine seemed very intelligent, cold and calculating to them. She was, according to them, the mastermind of this whole affair. The judicial machine then closed in on the brother and sister. Initially, the children's lawyers were hoping for a manslaughter charge and a juvenile sentence of 3 to 4 years in a juvenile detention center. Only, a few weeks later, a grand jury indicted them for first-degree murder. For him, Catherine and Curtis Jr. organized a calculated and premeditated plot. They knew right from wrong and committed a cold-blooded murder. In front of the judge, Catherine tearfully admitted to having shot Nicole, adding that there was no reason to do so. The grand jury therefore decided to judge them not as children, when they were only 12 and 13 years old, but as adults. They therefore face a life sentence. It should be noted that if the children had been tried as children, he would not have been able to obtain a sentence of more than 3 years. This indictment of the 2 youngest murderers in the United States has gone relatively unnoticed in the media. No one really tries to understand what could have pushed these 2 young teenagers to commit such a crime. With total indifference, the children are incarcerated and charged with first-degree murder. To avoid the life sentence, the children's lawyers decide to make a deal with the prosecutor. The brother and sister pleaded guilty to second-degree murder on August 16, 1999. Because of this agreement, there is no trial. Catherine and Curtis were eventually sentenced to 18 years in prison with life probation. They thus become the youngest in the United States to be convicted of murder by being tried as adults. However, years later, terrible revelations will completely revive this case. When they began their sentences, the two siblings were immediately separated, placed in detention centers for minors several dozen kilometers apart. Curtis, who is 13 years old, does not seem to really understand what is going on, nor the seriousness of their actions. When he is incarcerated, he asks if he can bring his Nintendo with him. It is therefore behind bars that Catherine and Curtis have spent most of their lives. This case did not make much noise at the time, despite the youth of the convicts. However, in 2009, after 10 years in prison, Catherine agreed to answer an interview for Florida Today from prison. The journalists also contacted Curtis, who refused to answer their questions. She says in this interview that she is not the calculating and cold killer described in the media. She reveals that she and her brother have been repeatedly assaulted for many years by their uncle, and this is the real motive for their crime. Their father's brother, as I told you before, had served a 6-year sentence for theft. And then he was found guilty of having sex with one of the girls in his countryside, who was 14 years old at the time. This man had abused them on many occasions, and everyone knew about it, including their parents, their mothers-in-law, as well as the institutions that had received several reports during the childhood of the two siblings. She explains that the murderous plan they had developed at the age of 12 and 13 was not limited to the murder of their stepmother, but also included the murder of their father and uncle in order to escape together from this hell. Looking back on her story, she confides that the first few days she felt relieved to find herself in prison. She had thought at that time that it was better for her to be in prison rather than in this house where she was a victim of abuse. She had quickly become disillusioned. For the 23-year-old, the first few years of incarceration were very difficult. Catherine was placed in solitary confinement without any psychological support. She could not talk to anyone. She was alone with what she had suffered and what she had done. It was only later, totally depressed and placed under surveillance for the risk of suicide, that she was finally able to meet a counselor. At the time, she did not realize what was at stake during the judicial process. She states that she and her brother were just 12 and 13-year-olds who needed to be loved and protected. She said during the interview, "I stopped being a child who needed protection, healing, who needed to be fed, because according to the state, I was now a convicted criminal. I was a murderer. They put me in a prison full of pedophiles and predators, and so the cycle of trauma continued. I was 15 years old the first time I was sexually assaulted by a correctional officer." She says that for the first few years, she and her brother kept in touch by writing letters to each other, until one day, a supervisor decided to enforce a rule prohibiting contact between co-accused in a case. They then lost all contact, which was extremely difficult. Fortunately, years later, as a gift from heaven, Catherine met a couple of pastors, Betty and Charles Williams, who taught in women's prisons. This meeting will change the life of the young girl. For the first time, she felt listened to, loved. She found in them surrogate parental figures. With their support, she gradually gained self-confidence. And in 2002, at 17 years old, still in prison, she graduated in prison. This is how, following this interview, the hell that Catherine and Curtis had lived through will be revealed. It all began in 1994, when Curtis, who was 8 years old at the time, made a shocking revelation to his mother during one of his visits to Kansas. He confided in her that he had been assaulted by his uncle. He details that he shares the same bed as the latter, and that sometimes when they are lying down, he caresses him. Stacy is upset by this confidence and decides to report the facts. On 22nd August 1994, the social services opened an investigation. However, as soon as he returned home, Curtis retracted his statements. Under pressure from his father, He now claims to have lied to his mother because he wanted to live with her full-time. The Child Protection Services then decided to close the case. For 4 years, Curtis no longer spoke about his assaults, and the children continued to live with their father and uncle. The sad reality is that Curtis continues to fall victim to his uncle's assaults, and the worst part is that he is not the only one. While he suffers her abuse in silence, he is unaware that his sister is going through the same thing. Catherine is also a victim of their uncle, who regularly abuses her, going so far as to impose fellatio on her that makes her vomit. Thus the children live a real hell, each one unaware that the other suffers the same atrocities. Meanwhile, Curtis Sr., the father, multiplies his conquests. Some are appreciated by the children, and others a little less so. In July 1998, he began a relationship with Nicole Speck. Nicole, who works with disabled children, already has 2 daughters from a previous marriage. She seems to be very appreciated by the children. At least that's what they tell their mother when they visit her. In August 1998, Nicole moved in with her daughters in the family, and she and Curtis planned to marry soon. However, quite quickly and for no apparent reason, she sends her 2 daughters, who got along well with Catherine and Curtis, to live with their grandmother in Alabama. A few weeks later, on September 22, 1998, when she was just 13 years old, Catherine ran away from home. She found refuge in a crisis center and refused to return home, claiming to be abused by her uncle. A new investigation by the social services was then opened. As part of the investigation, the staff of the school she attends is also questioned, and one of her teachers states that she does indeed think that Catherine is being abused by her uncle. A few days after his sister's runaway, on September 25th, Curtis, then 12 years old, was questioned. He denied having been mistreated. The next day, Catherine retracts her statements. She claims to have lied, denies having been abused, and agrees to return home. Despite suspicions and some indicators of physical and sexual violence, the social services decided to close the investigation once again. They simply offer the children's father advice and training on parenting, which he refuses. The social services still emphasize the fact that the children lived with a convicted pedophile and that this is not normal. But nothing more is done, and Catherine therefore returns to the family home. A few days later, on the way to school, Curtis, who is 12 years old, makes a terrible revelation to his sister that will change the course of their lives. He confides in her that he lied, and he thinks that she also lied. He reveals that he is really the victim of touching by his uncle and believes that his sister is also a victim. For Catherine, this revelation, despite the tragedy, is a real relief. While she thought that when her father learned the truth he would immediately side with him, even fantasizing that he wanted to kill his attacker, she had actually been pressured by her father, who had threatened and frightened her by telling her that she and her brother would be separated and placed in foster care if she did not retract her statements. It had been a real heart cream for the young teenager. Fallen from a height, she had the impression that her father had chosen her brother's side over his own, which had devastated him. At her worst, she felt alone and isolated, her family members not believing her and calling her a liar. In this context, Curtis's revelations will be a kind of relief. She was no longer alone against everyone. The brother and sister, who have always been close, will find themselves even more united by this tragic common experience. Now they have the impression of being alone in the world, alone in front of all the adults, alone in front of their family who protect their aggressor. They are angry with their attacker, their father, but also with Nicole, who, according to them, is also aware of it and does nothing to protect them. They think that if they want to get out of this hell, they will have to act alone. They will only be able to rely on themselves. The straw that broke the camel's back was a new abuse suffered by the teenager. One day, while she was in the shower, she heard the bathroom door open. When she realizes that it is her uncle who tears off the shower curtain and starts masturbating in front of her, Catherine is petrified. The teenager snuggles up in a corner of the shower and cries. When her attacker finished his case, without any consideration for the girl. He left the bathroom after leaving 50 cents on the toilet bowl. Catherine is in shock, feeling bad and dirty, convinced that this ordeal will never end. That evening, devastated, she refuses to eat and stays in her room without anyone worrying. Hurt and angry, she says she grabbed her diary that evening to write. Determined she plans to kill everyone, she is resolute. She confides in her brother and explains her macabre plan. He listens to him carefully, and in the end he offers to use their father's weapon, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, which he always keeps in his room. They will wait 2 weeks before taking action. The rest you know. Catherine's revelations during this interview in 2009 had a great echo and completely revived this case. The various reports and investigations carried out at the time by child protection agencies were confirmed Catherine had not lied. The siblings' lawyers at the time claimed that they knew nothing about it. If they had been informed of his abuse and violence, they would have presented the various investigations into the family by the social services to the prosecutor. Nevertheless, for Catherine and Curtis's lawyers, the abuse they had experienced could not constitute an effective line of defense because at the time of the tragedy, they were not in imminent danger. They had therefore not acted in self-defense, especially since Nicole had never hurt them. Social services have never had to explain why they were unable to protect these children or why they so quickly closed the investigations they had opened. Had there been a trial, the lawyers could have shown that they somehow had an understandable motive for the murder, and their conviction could certainly have been reduced. Catherine said that these years of detention were hell, especially because of the isolation, the separation from her brother, and the difficult conditions. As I told you before, she revealed that she was assaulted by a prison guard when she was 15 years old. She had complained to a supervisor she trusted and who had helped her formulate her complaint. But when she found herself in front of the inspector in charge of validating her complaint, he told her that she had misinterpreted the facts, arguing that the officer was of Italian origin and therefore naturally very tactile. He had given her 2 choices: to sign her complaint and return to solitary confinement, or to abandon her and return to the other inmates. Isolation was one of the most terrible things in prison for Catherine. Sometime later, she had learned that the officer who had assaulted him and the inspector who had questioned him were friends and played golf together. Meanwhile, Ramus Fleming, a Marine deployed on an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, discovers for the first time the terrible winter event involving Catherine. A fan of true crime, subscribe. He spends his free time browsing the criminal stories of his state of Florida, troubled by this case. He does not stop thinking about it in the following days. A few years later, he came across the interview of the young woman, particularly touched by Catherine's story. So he decided to send her a letter, and she replied. They stay in touch, write to each other regularly, and fall in love. On November 27, 2013, the couple married in the prison chapel. Catherine was 28 years old at the time. With his sentence coming to an end, with his release scheduled for 2015, Ramus decides to take early retirement to be fully present when he is released. Curtis, on the other hand, had already briefly tasted freedom in 2004 when he was 18 years old. While incarcerated, a hurricane brings down the prison's outer fence, and Curtis and several other criminals take advantage of the situation to escape. They were found and imprisoned again a few hours later. Curtis, who is very discreet, was finally released from prison on July 28, 2015, at the age of 29, 4 days before his sister, who was released on August 1st, at the age of 30. He got closer to the faith and began the process of becoming a pastor. When they get out of prison, brothers and sisters meet immediately. It is with a lot of hope, but also a lot of fear, that Catherine returns to society. At 30, she has never driven a car, never used a cell phone, or attended high school. She says, "I leave prison as ignorant as I was at 13. Years later, in May 2023, she spoke again in the press. Now a 38-year-old mother of four, she is involved in a group of police officers, pastors, prosecutors, and activists who work to prevent violence, especially among young people, and for fair sentences for minors. When asked about her past, she replies, "There is no justification for taking someone else's life. I took the life of an innocent girl. In my 13-year-old mind, I had a bunch of reasons why I felt hopeless, trapped, angry, and bitter. But nothing justifies what I did, and I don't even try to do it." She is now in what she calls her life of redemption, hoping that the scales will balance out and that she will succeed in doing more good than harm. Since her release from prison, she has been fighting to ban life sentences for minors without parole. She states, "Children are not born bad. 80% of children sentenced to life have suffered physical or sexual trauma." It is really a sad and sobering case. It has many victims and culprits who remain unpunished. The first victim is, of course, Nicole, who was only 29 years old and left behind two orphaned little girls, forced to grow up and build themselves without their mother. However, for me, Catherine and Curtis are, despite their terrible crime, also victims. First of all, they are victims of their parents' poor choices. Their mother, a victim of violence, left them with their father in full knowledge of the facts. I understand that she had to flee for her life, but I don't understand why. Later, when she was better recovered, she didn't fight to regain custody of her children, especially after the first red flag when her 8-year-old son confessed to her that he was being abused. There is also a terrible story of racism in this case. Stacy's parents, as Catherine recounted, did not want her to date a black man, and they refused to let her come back with her children because they were mixed race, which is purely scandalous. They also know, I imagine, that their son-in-law, Curtis Sr., was violent, and that didn't stop them from leaving his poor children to their sad fate. Catherine and Curtis have issued alerts several times, but no one has listened to them. Worse still, their father put pressure on them each time to retract their statement. I must admit that I do not understand how the social services could so easily close the files. I mean, children don't make such accusations for no reason, especially if there have been several. When Catherine ran away, they should have known that there had been other alerts about the family. There were already Curtis's accusations, and once the school had also made a report because Curtis had arrived with a black eye. So it wasn't a model family that had never attracted attention, especially since they knew that their uncle was a criminal, convicted of abusing the daughter of one of his companions, and they did nothing. In my opinion, they bear a great responsibility for this crime. If they had done their job properly, none of this would have happened. Unfortunately, and here again, the children were victims of the judicial system, this time by pleading guilty. They were 12 and 13 years old, and everyone thought it was just a matter of jealousy. There was therefore no trial, and neither the social services nor their father or uncle were held accountable for their act. To this day, as far as I have been able to find, their uncle has never had to answer for the acts he inflicted on Catherine and Curtis. Worse, in the various articles that I found, his identity was always protected under the pretext that he had never been formally accused of these facts. So a parent is mentioned without specifying who or giving his identity. It was only after her release that Catherine revealed that it was her uncle. However, I wonder about the real motive for Nicole's murder. 10 years after the tragedy, Catherine said that they had been abused and that they were planning to kill their father and uncle as well before fleeing. Was it really the motive? Why did they coldly shoot Nicole when she had done nothing to them? Especially since their uncle did not live with them during this period. He regularly came to see his brother, but that day he was not supposed to be present. They were young, barely 12 and 13 years old. So I understand that their murderous thinking and plan were not the most elaborate. But all the same, they had premeditated this crime, all prepared. So why hadn't they planned everything to kill their uncle, who had been their aggressor for years, instead of killing their stepmother, who had never been violent with them, who had two little girls who loved to take Catherine as a model, and whom they had only known for 6 months? Despite the sadness of this case, I hope you enjoyed the way I presented it to you. I thank all those still present at the end of this video, and if this is your case, you can let me know by writing Nicole in the comments. If you want to support my work, you can like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you soon for a new deadly truth.